For decades, reports from America's highways have contained details that seem difficult to place together. A stranded vehicle sits beside the road, but the driver is gone. A phone call ends in the middle of a sentence. Witnesses describe seeing someone walking along a highway in the darkness, only for that person to disappear before help arrives. In some cases, search teams follow promising clues for miles before they suddenly stop at the edge of the road. None of these incidents occurred in the same place, yet they leave behind an unsettling impression that investigators have never fully explained. As you move through these cases, you will encounter lonely mountain highways, remote forest roads, roadside rest areas, and stretches of pavement where ordinary journeys took unexpected turns. The evidence often appears straightforward at first. Then a witness account, a missing traveller, or a final phone call introduces a question that refuses to go away. Why do so many of these stories seem to end at the road itself, while the people at the centre of them are never seen again? The man who walked away from his truck and vanished. Not every disappearance begins in a wilderness area or along a forgotten back road. Some begin on highways crowded with traffic, where headlights pass through the darkness every few seconds and thousands of people move from one destination to another without interruption. In places like these, it seems impossible for a person to simply vanish. There are witnesses, cameras, businesses, and endless streams of travellers. Yet some of the most puzzling missing person cases in America have unfolded beside roads where someone should have been noticed. A vehicle is found, personal belongings remain behind, the route is known, and still the person at the centre of the story is never seen again. One such mystery unfolded in the spring of 2019, when a young man named Marshall Iwasa set out on what appeared to be an ordinary errand. Nothing about the day suggested that it would become the beginning of a disappearance that remains unresolved years later. By the time investigators started piecing together his movements, they found themselves following a trail that stretched across hundreds of miles of highways and ended in a place that seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Marshall Iwasa was 26 years old and lived in Alberta, Canada. He had attended the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology and studied computer science, though his family later learned he had been facing personal and academic difficulties that he had largely kept to himself. In November 2019, he told family members he intended to retrieve equipment from a storage locker before returning to Calgary. It sounded routine. There was no indication that he planned to disappear, abandon his life, or travel far from home. According to investigators, he was last seen in Lethbridge, Alberta, on November 17th. After that, the certainty surrounding his movements quickly began to dissolve. Surveillance footage helped establish part of the timeline. Records showed Marshall making repeated attempts to access his storage unit before finally entering it during the early morning hours of November 18th. He remained there for more than 2 hours. At some point afterward, he left the area, and that was effectively the last confirmed trace of him. His family expected him to continue toward Calgary. Instead, communication stopped, and concern gradually grew as the hours passed. What happened after he left the storage facility would become one of the central mysteries of the case. Missing person investigations often begin with a clear direction, a known destination, a financial trail, a witness, a phone signal. In Marshall's case, those pieces never aligned into a coherent story. Days passed with no confirmed sightings and no indication of where he had gone. Then, nearly a week after his disappearance, a discovery in the mountains of British Columbia transformed the investigation. Hikers travelling along a remote logging road near Pemberton came across a burned vehicle at the end of an isolated route leading toward the Brian Waddington Hut area. The truck was identified as Marshall's. The location immediately raised questions. The site was roughly 14 hours away from Lethbridge by road. Family members said Marshall had no known connection to the area. Investigators could not establish any obvious reason he would have travelled there. The road itself was remote and difficult to access, ending in rugged terrain surrounded by wilderness. It was not a place someone would normally encounter by accident during a routine trip. Somehow, between leaving his storage locker and the discovery of the vehicle, Marshall had crossed hundreds of miles of highways and entered one of the most isolated regions in Western Canada. What investigators found around the truck only deepened the mystery. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the area. Identification documents remained behind. Damaged electronic devices, including cell phones and a laptop, were found near the vehicle. Some items appeared deliberately destroyed, others seemed simply discarded. The truck itself had been burned. Looking at the scene, investigators faced a difficult question. Was this evidence of someone trying to disappear voluntarily, or evidence that something far more troubling had happened? The challenge with both explanations was that neither seemed to fit perfectly. If Marshall intended to vanish intentionally, why travel such an extraordinary distance to an area where he had no known ties? Why leave behind essential belongings and transportation? On the other hand, if another person had been involved, investigators struggled to identify evidence pointing clearly toward a criminal act. Authorities acknowledged that the circumstances were suspicious, yet years later, no definitive explanation emerged. Search efforts focused heavily on the wilderness surrounding the burned truck. The terrain was unforgiving. Dense forests, steep slopes, changing weather conditions, and vast expanses of backcountry created enormous challenges for investigators and volunteers alike. Helicopters, search teams, and specialized personnel examined areas near the discovery site. Yet despite repeated efforts, no confirmed trace of Marshall himself was located. The truck remained the most significant physical clue, standing silently at the center of a mystery that refused to provide answers. As the months passed, the case began attracting wider attention. The unusual combination of factors made it difficult to compare with more conventional missing person investigations. There was a documented route that made little sense. There was a vehicle discovered far from the expected destination. There was evidence suggesting planning, yet also evidence suggesting chaos. Every new detail seemed to support multiple interpretations simultaneously. Instead of narrowing possibilities, the available facts often expanded them. Family members became some of the most persistent voices in the search for answers. They questioned whether important aspects of the case had been overlooked and expressed concern about how the disappearance had been categorized. They returned to the area near Pemberton, hoping that a closer examination of the landscape might reveal something investigators had missed. Yet every trip ended the same way. The mountains remained silent. The forests revealed nothing. The distance between the known facts and the unknown fate of Marshall Iwasa remained as large as ever. Then another troubling detail emerged. Comparisons between photographs taken by the hikers, who initially discovered the truck, and photographs taken later, suggested that the scene may have changed before authorities fully documented it. Questions arose about whether items had been moved or whether someone had returned to the location after the vehicle was found. These observations did not prove criminal activity, but they introduced another layer of uncertainty into an investigation already filled with unanswered questions. Cases involving highways often contain a strange contradiction. Roads are designed to connect places. They create records, witnesses, fuel purchases, traffic cameras, and predictable movement. Investigators usually rely on those things to reconstruct a person's journey. Yet in some disappearances, the highway seems to do the opposite. Instead of providing answers, it becomes a corridor leading toward uncertainty. Every mile traveled creates more possibilities. Every intersection introduces another unknown direction. By the time investigators begin retracing the route, the trail has already fragmented into countless possibilities. Marshall's disappearance reflects that contradiction perfectly. Investigators know he left Lethbridge. They know his truck eventually reached a remote logging road near Pemberton. They know the vehicle was burned. They know personal belongings were left behind. Yet the most important part of the story remains missing. No witness has explained why he travelled there. No evidence has revealed what happened after he arrived. No confirmed sighting has placed him anywhere beyond the final traces associated with the truck. Years have passed since that November journey began. Searches have continued. Public interest has resurfaced periodically. Theories have been proposed and debated. Some focus on the possibility of voluntary disappearance. Others point toward foul play. Still others suggest that something happened in the wilderness after he reached the mountains. None of those theories have been supported by enough evidence to close the case. The central mystery remains untouched by the passage of time. What makes the story especially unsettling is how ordinary it appeared at the beginning. There was no dramatic farewell, no known threat, no indication that the coming days would produce one of Canada's most perplexing missing person investigations. A young man left to complete a routine task. A vehicle travelled across provinces. A burned truck appeared at the end of a remote road. And somewhere between those facts, the person at the centre of the story vanished completely. Because even now, investigators can explain how Marshall Iwasa's truck reached the mountains, but not how Marshall himself disappeared from the journey. the woman who disappeared along Interstate 40. Few things feel more certain than a highway stretching toward the horizon, carrying travellers steadily from one known place to another. Every mile marker suggests progress. Every exit sign points toward a destination. For most people, a long journey ends exactly where it is supposed to end, becoming little more than a memory of gas stations, changing landscapes, and hours spent watching the road unwind beneath the wheels. Yet some journeys leave behind a different kind of trail. The route can be reconstructed, the vehicle can be located, the timeline can be partially assembled. But somewhere along the way, the traveller disappears from the story. What remains is not a missing road or an unknown destination, but a missing person whose final movements seem to dissolve into uncertainty. Long before investigators began retracing her route across America, Leah Roberts was navigating a period of profound personal loss. Born in North Carolina, she experienced a series of tragedies while still a young woman. Her father died from heart disease when she was a teenager, and only a few years later her mother was killed in a car accident. The losses affected her deeply. Friends and family later described someone who was thoughtful, intelligent, and increasingly reflective about the direction of her life. She attended North Carolina State University, but as the years passed, the future she had once envisioned appeared less certain. By the spring of 2000, she was searching for something difficult to define, a sense of purpose that seemed to lie somewhere beyond the routine she had known. Rather than continue along the path she'd once planned for herself, Leah made a decision that surprised many people around her. In March 2000, at the age of 23, she withdrew money from her bank account, packed her belongings, and left North Carolina in her Jeep Cherokee. She left notes for loved ones, indicating that she needed time to think and travel. There was no evidence that she intended to disappear permanently. Instead, the journey appeared deeply personal, an attempt to step away from familiar surroundings and reflect on the events that had shaped her life. To those closest to her, it seemed less like a disappearance and more like a road trip undertaken by someone searching for clarity. Maps, receipts, and scattered sightings later revealed the outline of an extraordinary journey across the country. Leah travelled westward through multiple states, covering thousands of miles along highways that cut through deserts, plains, mountains, and forests. Investigators later confirmed various stops through financial records and witness accounts. The trip was not hurried. It unfolded gradually, suggesting that the journey itself mattered as much as the destination. Interstate 40 formed part of the route during her travels west, carrying her across vast stretches of the American landscape. The highway linked distant cities and endless miles of open terrain, becoming one segment of a journey that appeared guided more by curiosity than by a fixed plan. Among the belongings connected to her travels was evidence of a fascination with the freedom celebrated in classic American road literature. Leah was known to admire the work of author Jack Kerouac, particularly On the Road, a novel that had become closely associated with ideas of self-discovery through travel. Friends later recalled her interest in the book and its themes. Looking back, some observers saw parallels between Leah's journey and the restless search for meaning described in those pages. Yet unlike a fictional adventure, Leah's travels unfolded in the real world, where highways ended at actual destinations and every mile left behind tangible evidence. The romantic image of the open road would eventually collide with a mystery that no one could explain. Eventually, the documented trail narrowed to a handful of final movements that investigators could place with confidence. Records suggested that Leah continued moving through the western United States before entering Washington state. At some point during the weeks following her departure, contact with family members ceased. Unlike many missing person cases, there was no single dramatic moment when alarm immediately spread. The concern developed gradually as communication became increasingly infrequent and then stopped altogether. Family members who expected updates from her journey instead found themselves facing growing uncertainty. By the time authorities became involved, investigators were attempting to reconstruct movements that stretched across an enormous geographic area. Far from the busy interstates that had carried her westward, a discovery in Washington state changed the direction of the investigation. On March 18, 2000, Leah's Jeep Cherokee was found near Canyon Creek Road in Whatcom County, an area surrounded by rugged terrain and dense forest. The vehicle was located down an embankment in a remote area not far from the Mount Baker region. At first glance, it appeared that the Jeep had left the road and crashed. Yet as investigators examined the scene more closely, they noticed details that complicated that explanation. The crash itself did not appear entirely straightforward, and questions began emerging almost immediately about how the vehicle ended up where it was found. Questions multiplied almost immediately after authorities examined the condition of the abandoned Jeep. The vehicle had sustained significant damage, but investigators noted indications that suggested it may have been intentionally driven down the embankment, rather than accidentally crashing. Inside and around the Jeep, several personal belongings remained behind. Money was found, clothing was present, food was discovered. The circumstances did not resemble a simple roadside accident followed by a walk for help. If Leah had survived a crash, there was no obvious explanation for why she would leave behind so many essential items. If another scenario had unfolded, investigators struggled to determine exactly what it might have been. Steep terrain, dense vegetation, and vast stretches of wilderness complicated every effort to locate a definitive answer. Search teams examined the area surrounding the Jeep, focusing on locations where someone might have travelled after leaving the vehicle. The landscape was challenging. Thick forests covered much of the region, while mountains and uneven terrain created countless places where evidence could remain hidden. Despite extensive search efforts, no confirmed trace of Leah was found. The absence of physical evidence became one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. Investigators had a vehicle, a location, and a broad timeline, yet they lacked the single piece of evidence needed to explain what happened after the Jeep came to rest. Years after the disappearance, a surprising claim introduced a new layer of uncertainty into an already perplexing case. A man later contacted investigators and reported information that suggested he may have encountered Leah after her vehicle was discovered. According to accounts associated with the investigation, he claimed that he had provided transportation to a woman matching Leah's description. The information attracted attention because it offered a possible explanation for how she might have left the area. Yet the account was difficult to verify completely. Investigators examined the claim, but it ultimately failed to provide the breakthrough needed to resolve the mystery. Instead, it became another fragment of information suspended between possibility and uncertainty. No single explanation has ever managed to account for every known detail surrounding Leah Roberts' fate. Some theories suggest she intentionally disappeared to begin a new life elsewhere. Others argue that she may have encountered danger after abandoning the Jeep. Certain investigators have considered the possibility of foul play, while others have focused on the possibility that an accident occurred somewhere beyond the immediate search area. Each theory explains part of the story, while leaving significant questions unanswered. A voluntary disappearance struggles to account for the circumstances surrounding the vehicle. An accident fails to explain the complete absence of evidence. Foul play remains difficult to prove because of the limited physical clues available. The mystery persists because none of the available explanations fit comfortably with all the known facts. More than 2 decades later, the journey remains traceable across thousands of miles before abruptly dissolving into mystery. Investigators can follow Leah's route from North Carolina toward the American West. They can identify portions of her travels through records and witness accounts. They can pinpoint the remote location where her Jeep was eventually discovered. Yet the most important section of the timeline remains missing. Somewhere between the highways she travelled and the wilderness where the vehicle was found, certainty disappears. The trail becomes fragmented, transforming a documented cross-country journey into one of the most enduring missing person cases in modern American history. Unlike many disappearances that begin with a sudden emergency or an obvious threat, Leah Roberts' story unfolded slowly. It began with a decision to travel, to think, and perhaps to heal after years marked by loss. The highways carried her westward exactly as intended. The receipts, records, and sightings confirmed that much. Yet the further investigators followed her route, the closer they came to a point where the evidence simply stopped. Beyond that point lies only speculation, a space where theories multiply and answers remain absent. The westbound road can still be followed on a map, but the moment Leah Roberts vanished remains hidden somewhere beyond its final known turn. The Yuba County 5 and the road into the mountains. Certain mysteries begin not with danger, but with a choice so unusual that investigators spend decades trying to understand why it was ever made. In many missing person cases, the central question revolves around what happened after someone disappeared. The Yuba County 5 case is different. Here, the mystery begins before the disappearances themselves. It begins with a road that should have led home, a destination that was only a short drive away, and a decision that carried 5 men in precisely the opposite direction. Everything that followed would become one of the most baffling unsolved cases in American history, but the first puzzle remains the most difficult to answer. Why did they go into the mountains at all? 5 young men from the Yuba City area had spent months looking forward to the events planned for the following day. Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Ted Wire, Jackie Hewitt, and Gary Mathias were close friends who shared a passion for basketball through a program designed for individuals with intellectual disabilities. 4 of the men had mild intellectual disabilities, while Gary Mathias, a US Army veteran, had been diagnosed with schizophrenia but was considered stable while taking medication. Family members described the group as responsible, predictable, and excited about the basketball tournament scheduled for February 25, 1978. They had uniforms prepared, plans arranged, and every intention of participating. Nothing about their personalities or circumstances suggested they were about to embark on a mysterious journey into remote mountain terrain. Basketball was the focus of the evening as the group travelled to Chico on February 24, 1978. They attended a game between California State University, Chico, and the University of California, Davis. Witnesses later recalled seeing the men enjoying themselves. The outing was ordinary and uncomplicated, exactly the kind of recreational trip they frequently made together. After the game ended, they began the drive back toward Yuba City. Their families expected them home later that night. The weather in the valley was manageable, and the route was familiar. By every reasonable expectation, the story should have ended with 5 friends returning home after a successful evening. Shortly before their trail disappeared, the men stopped at a convenience store to buy snacks for the drive home. A clerk later remembered the group purchasing candy bars, soft drinks, and other items. The receipt helped establish one of the final confirmed points in the timeline. It also reinforced the impression that nothing unusual was happening. The purchases suggested a group preparing for a normal drive, not a group contemplating a dramatic change of plans. Investigators would later study these final sightings in extraordinary detail, searching for any indication that something had already begun to go wrong. None was found. Every known detail of the case points to a route that should have carried them safely back to Yuba City that night. Instead, something happened after they left Chico. Rather than heading south and west toward home, the group somehow ended up traveling east into the Sierra Nevada mountains. The exact moment of the detour remains unknown. No witnesses reported seeing them make the decision. No evidence has ever explained the reason behind it. The roads leading into the mountains were not part of their intended route. They led away from family, away from familiar surroundings, and toward increasingly isolated terrain. Yet for reasons that remain unclear, the men continued driving deeper into the wilderness. Instead of descending toward home, the group's movements led upward into the remote reaches of the Sierra Nevada. As the elevation increased, temperatures dropped. Snow-covered portions of the landscape and the roads became increasingly difficult to navigate. The farther they travelled, the less sense the journey appeared to make. None of the men had any known reason to be in the area. They were not experienced wilderness travellers. They had important plans waiting for them the next morning. Yet the evidence later showed that they continued driving for many miles beyond any point where a simple navigation mistake would seem plausible. The mountains ahead grew darker and more isolated with every passing mile. Long after family members reported the men missing, searchers discovered a vehicle in a place where it had no obvious reason to be. On February 28th, 4 days after the disappearance, a forest ranger found Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego abandoned on a remote mountain road near Oroville Quincy Road. The location immediately raised questions. The car was far from the route home and deep within an area known for difficult terrain and harsh winter conditions. Yet the vehicle itself offered surprisingly few clues. It was not stuck in snow. Investigators later concluded that it was capable of being driven away. There was fuel remaining in the tank. No significant mechanical problem was found. Whatever caused the men to stop, it apparently was not a breakdown. Calculations of distance, weather, and terrain soon revealed the scale of the challenge facing rescuers. Search teams entered the mountains looking for signs of the missing men, but the area covered vast stretches of forest and rugged landscape. Snow complicated the operation. Time continued to pass. Weeks turned into months without answers. The abandoned Mercury Montego remained the most significant clue, yet it provided no explanation for why 5 men would leave a functioning vehicle and continue on foot through such difficult conditions. Every attempt to reconstruct their decisions seemed to create more questions. Investigators could identify what had happened. They could not explain why. Nearly 4 months after the disappearance, a breakthrough emerged deep within the forests of Plumas National Forest. Searchers located a Forest Service trailer approximately 19 miles from where the Mercury Montego had been abandoned. Inside, they discovered the body of Ted Wire. The condition of the scene transformed the investigation. Evidence suggested that Ted had survived for weeks, possibly months after entering the trailer. He had lost a significant amount of weight but appeared to have lived long after the initial disappearance. The discovery immediately shifted attention toward understanding how the group reached the trailer and what had happened during the time between leaving the vehicle and arriving there. Survival supplies capable of sustaining someone for an extended period became one of the most perplexing aspects of the investigation. The trailer contained food, heating materials, clothing, and other resources. Investigators discovered that large quantities of food remained untouched. Matches were available, fuel for heating was present, yet many of these supplies had not been fully utilized. Ted appeared to have survived using some of the available resources, but not all of them. The situation suggested that at least some members of the group had reached the trailer alive and had attempted to survive. What it did not explain was why they failed to take advantage of supplies that could potentially have prolonged survival even further. This aspect of the case would become one of its most debated elements. Recovery efforts eventually revealed portions of the group's final journey, though critical gaps remained impossible to fill. The remains of Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jackie Hewitt were found in different locations within the wilderness. The distances between these discoveries indicated that the men had travelled through difficult terrain after abandoning the vehicle. The circumstances suggested a prolonged struggle against the environment, yet one member of the group remained missing. Gary Mathias was never found. Because he was familiar with military survival training, and because evidence suggested he may have been among those who reached the trailer, his disappearance became a mystery within the larger mystery. Decades later, no confirmed trace of him has ever been located. At the centre of the entire case lies a question that has resisted every attempt at explanation since 1978. Theories have emerged over the years. Some suggest the men became lost after following someone into the mountains. Others propose they may have encountered a situation that frightened them and caused them to flee. Witness accounts have occasionally added intriguing possibilities, including reports from a man who claimed to have seen people with flashlights near the area where the vehicle was abandoned. Yet none of these explanations fully account for the known facts. No theory successfully explains why the group travelled so far from their intended route, why they abandoned a functioning vehicle, or why they continued into terrain that offered little chance of safety. Unlike many missing person cases, the Yuba County 5 mystery does not revolve around a single disappearance. It revolves around a chain of decisions. Each decision appears to lead logically to the next question while providing no logical explanation for itself. Why leave Chico? Why head into the mountains? Why abandon the car? Why continue on foot? Why leave critical supplies unused? The deeper investigators examine the case, the more the mystery seemed to shift away from the physical evidence and toward the choices made along the way. Those choices remain frozen in time, preserved by a landscape that has never revealed what truly happened during those final hours. Whatever drew the Yuba County 5 away from the road home continues to vanish into the mountains ahead of every answer that tries to follow it. The empty vehicle beside the highway. Parked along roadsides across North America are vehicles that became the final confirmed trace of someone who never returned to claim them. Some sit on the shoulder of a highway. Others rest beside rural roads or at the edge of isolated intersections. To passing motorists, they appear ordinary, perhaps the result of a breakdown or a minor accident. Yet for investigators, these abandoned vehicles often mark the beginning of a mystery rather than the end of a journey. The engine can be examined, the route can be reconstructed, personal belongings can be catalogued. What cannot always be explained is why the person who drove the vehicle suddenly vanished from the story. Investigators often describe abandoned vehicles as valuable pieces of evidence, yet some seem to reveal almost nothing about the fate of their drivers. A vehicle preserves a moment in time. It shows where a journey stopped. It may contain phones, wallets, clothing, receipts, and countless clues about the hours before a disappearance. In theory, those clues should help narrow possibilities. In practice, some abandoned vehicles create more uncertainty than answers. The cases of Brandon Lawson, Maura Murray, and Jason Landry remain among the most discussed examples. Their disappearances occurred years apart and under very different circumstances, yet each investigation began with the same unsettling discovery: a vehicle standing alone while its driver was nowhere to be found. Shortly after midnight on August 9, 2013, Brandon Lawson found himself stranded beside a highway in West Texas. The 36-year-old father had left his home in San Angelo after an argument and was driving toward Crowley, Texas, where he planned to stay with family members. At some point during the trip, his pickup truck ran out of fuel near US Highway 277 in Coke County. Brandon called his brother Kyle Lawson, asking for assistance. The situation initially appeared straightforward. A stranded motorist needed help. There was little reason to believe that the night would become the beginning of one of the most debated missing person cases in recent American history. Authorities searching the area located Brandon's truck, but the discovery immediately deepened the mystery. The vehicle was found along the roadside near the location Brandon had described during phone calls. Personal items remained inside. The truck itself offered no obvious explanation for what happened next. Witnesses later reported seeing Brandon outside the vehicle. His brother drove to the area in an attempt to help him, but the encounter never unfolded as expected. According to accounts from that night, Brandon remained somewhere nearby, speaking by phone and moving through the darkness. Then, without warning, contact was lost. Recorded only minutes before he disappeared, a brief emergency call would become one of the most analysed pieces of evidence in the case. Brandon placed a 911 call during which he appeared distressed and attempted to describe a situation unfolding around him. The audio was difficult to interpret, leading to years of speculation regarding what exactly he was trying to communicate. Investigators examined the recording repeatedly, while family members and independent researchers debated its meaning. Some believed Brandon had witnessed criminal activity. Others argued that confusion and poor reception contributed to the uncertainty. Whatever the explanation, the call captured the final known moments before Brandon vanished from the roadside. For years, family members, investigators, and online communities struggled to determine exactly what happened after Brandon left the roadside. Search efforts covered large sections of the surrounding terrain, including fields, brush, and nearby properties. Yet no confirmed trace of him was found. The absence of evidence transformed a missing person investigation into an enduring mystery. Then, nearly 9 years later, human remains were discovered in the area near where Brandon had disappeared. In 2022, authorities confirmed through DNA analysis that the remains belonged to Brandon Lawson. While the discovery answered one question, it did not resolve every uncertainty surrounding his final hours. The circumstances that led him away from the truck and into the darkness remain the subject of continued discussion. Cases like Brandon Lawson's are unsettling because they are not unique. Across the United States, abandoned vehicles repeatedly appear at the center of missing person investigations. The details vary, but the image remains remarkably consistent. A car is located. Personal belongings remain behind. The driver disappears. The surrounding evidence suggests a sequence of events, yet never enough to explain what truly happened. One of the most famous examples emerged in New Hampshire during the winter of 2004. On a winter evening in New Hampshire, another abandoned vehicle would become the starting point of an enduring mystery. On February 9, 2004, 21-year-old Maura Murray was driving along Route 112 near the town of Haverhill when her Saturn sedan left the roadway and struck a snowbank. A local resident contacted emergency services after observing the crash. Another witness later reported speaking briefly with Maura, who declined assistance and stated that she had already contacted roadside help. By the time law enforcement arrived only a short time later, she was gone. The vehicle remained at the scene, but the driver had disappeared. Evidence found inside the car suggested that Maura's journey had ended abruptly. Personal belongings remained behind. The crash itself was relatively minor. Search dogs later attempted to follow her scent, but the trail reportedly ended near the roadway. The disappearance generated enormous public interest and remains one of the most widely discussed missing person cases in America. Entire books, documentaries, and investigative projects have focused on her fate. Yet despite years of examination, the central question remains unchanged. How did someone disappear so quickly after a roadside accident on a public road? Her case will be explored in greater detail later, but even in brief form it demonstrates how an abandoned vehicle can become the focal point of a mystery that survives for decades. More than 15 years after Maura Murray vanished, a remarkably similar image appeared in another investigation hundreds of miles away. On December 13, 2020, 21-year-old Texas State University student Jason Landry left his apartment in San Marcos and began driving toward his family home in Missouri City, Texas. The trip should have taken only a few hours. Instead, sometime during the night, his Nissan Altima left a rural road near Luling, Texas. The vehicle crashed through a fence and came to rest in an isolated area. When authorities located the car, Jason was gone. Scattered belongings and a damaged vehicle mark the place where Jason Landry's known movements came to an end. Investigators found clothing, personal items, and evidence suggesting he had been present after the crash. Yet there was no clear indication of where he went afterward. Search teams combed the surrounding area. Drones, tracking dogs, volunteers, and law enforcement personnel participated in extensive efforts to locate him. The landscape around the crash site consisted of fields, brush, and rural terrain that appeared difficult but not impossible to search. Despite those efforts, Jason was not found. The mystery deepened as weeks became months and months became years. Viewed individually, each disappearance presents its own challenges and unanswered questions. Brandon Lawson's case involved a late-night roadside emergency and a cryptic phone call. Maura Murray's disappearance followed a crash on a snowy New Hampshire road and unfolded within a remarkably short window of time. Jason Landry vanished after a rural crash scene left behind a collection of physical clues but no clear direction of travel. The circumstances differ significantly, yet each case shares a common feature. Investigators were not searching for a missing vehicle. They already had the vehicle. What they lacked was an explanation for why the driver was no longer there. Standing beside an abandoned vehicle often feels like standing at the edge of a story, with its final pages removed. Investigators can identify where the journey paused. They can examine what was left behind and reconstruct many of the events leading up to that moment. What they cannot always determine is what happened afterward. Did the driver leave voluntarily? Did an accident occur beyond the search area? Was another person involved? These questions emerge repeatedly because the evidence preserved within the vehicle rarely extends beyond the moment it was abandoned. Highways, rural roads, and roadside shoulders connect these cases in another way. Each location exists within systems designed for movement. Roads carry people from one place to another. Vehicles transform distance into routine travel. Yet in these investigations, the road becomes a boundary rather than a connection. On one side lies the known journey. On the other lies uncertainty. The abandoned vehicle marks the dividing line between the two. The drivers disappeared in different places and under different circumstances, but the empty vehicles remained behind as if waiting for someone to explain what happened after the road suddenly stopped. The last stop at the rest area. Most travellers spend only a few minutes at a rest area, yet some investigations remain there for decades. These roadside spaces are designed to be temporary. People stop to stretch their legs, use a restroom, buy a drink, or check a map before continuing toward their destination. Names are rarely exchanged. Faces are quickly forgotten. Cars arrive and leave in a constant flow that blurs one traveller into the next. Because of that, rest areas and roadside stops occupy a strange place in missing person investigations. They are public locations filled with potential witnesses, yet they often become places where the final confirmed sighting of a person leads nowhere at all. Between one destination and the next exists a landscape of parking lots, vending machines, fuel stops, and brief encounters with strangers. Investigators frequently rely on these locations when reconstructing the final movements of missing people. A receipt can establish a timeline, a witness can confirm a sighting, a surveillance camera can capture a few crucial moments, yet these same locations present challenges. Travellers rarely pay close attention to one another. A person can walk through a crowded stop and leave almost no lasting impression. By the time investigators begin asking questions, the people who might have seen something important have already continued down the highway, disappearing into hundreds of different destinations. During the early hours of February 14, 2000, several motorists reported an unexpected sight along a North Carolina highway. The person they observed was 9-year-old Asher Degree. Earlier that night, she had left her family home in Shelby, North Carolina, under circumstances that remain unexplained. Heavy rain moved through the area, and the roads were dark. Yet multiple witnesses later reported seeing a young girl walking along Highway 18. For investigators, those sightings would become some of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. They established that Asha had left the area around her home and was travelling beside a roadway where passing motorists briefly observed her, before continuing on their way. Independent witness accounts would later become some of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. One truck driver initially believed he was seeing a small adult walking beside the road. Concerned by the unusual sight, he reportedly turned his vehicle around to get another look. As he approached, the girl left the roadside and moved into a wooded area. Another motorist also reported seeing a young girl matching Asha's description. The observations occurred in a relatively narrow time frame, helping investigators build a partial timeline of her movements. Yet even with those sightings, a critical question remained unanswered. Why was a 9-year-old child walking along a highway before dawn during a rainstorm? Search teams mobilized quickly, but the road offered few answers about where the traveler had gone. Law enforcement agencies, volunteers, and search personnel examined areas surrounding the highway. Attention focused on locations where Asha might have sought shelter or assistance. During the investigation, some of her belongings were eventually recovered, including items found miles from where she had last been seen. Despite extensive efforts, however, the circumstances surrounding her disappearance remained unresolved. The roadside sightings established that she had been present. They did not explain where she was going or what happened after witnesses lost sight of her. Her case remains one of North Carolina's most enduring mysteries and will be examined more closely later in this series. Hundreds of miles away and decades earlier, another disappearance began beside a roadway under equally puzzling circumstances. On April 20th, 1989, Patricia Meehan was involved in a vehicle collision near Circle, Montana. The accident itself was relatively minor. Witnesses observed the aftermath and expected the situation to unfold in a routine manner. Instead, they found themselves watching the beginning of a mystery. Patricia survived the crash, exited her vehicle, and remained visible to people at the scene. Then, in a sequence of events that continues to perplex investigators, she disappeared. Following a collision near Circle, Montana, Patricia Meehan stepped out of her vehicle and entered one of the strangest missing person cases in the country. Witnesses later described her behaviour as unusual. Accounts indicated that she appeared disoriented after the accident. Rather than remaining at the scene to exchange information or seek assistance, she wandered away from the roadway. People nearby watched her movements. This detail makes the case especially unusual. In many disappearances, there are no witnesses to the final moments. Patricia's disappearance unfolded in view of other people, yet despite their presence, no one could explain where she ultimately went. People were present when Patricia vanished, which only made the mystery more difficult to understand. Search efforts began in the surrounding area and continued for years afterward. Investigators explored numerous leads and considered the possibility that she had survived and started a new life elsewhere. Reported sightings emerged from various locations over the years, though none were conclusively verified. The lack of definitive evidence allowed competing theories to develop. Some suggested that Patricia succumbed to the environment after leaving the accident scene. Others believed she may have travelled far from Montana. What remained consistent across every theory was the absence of proof. Witnesses saw her leave the roadway, but no one could explain where that path eventually led. Unlike isolated wilderness disappearances, roadside mysteries often unfold in places designed for constant human activity. Highways connect communities, carry commercial traffic, and move millions of travellers across vast distances. Rest areas and roadside facilities exist because people are expected to stop there. The expectation of movement creates an unusual challenge for investigators. A traveller standing beside a highway rarely appears out of place. Someone entering a rest area attracts little attention. Vehicles come and go continuously. Under those conditions, an important observation can easily be overlooked because it appears completely ordinary at the time. Crowds create an illusion of security that investigators sometimes discover is surprisingly fragile. When people imagine dangerous situations, they often picture isolation. Yet many disappearances occur in locations where other individuals are nearby. The challenge is not necessarily the absence of witnesses, it is the absence of witnesses who realise they are observing something significant. A truck driver may notice someone walking along a roadway. A traveller may briefly see a person standing near a rest stop entrance. A store employee may remember serving a customer. None of those observations seem important until investigators begin reconstructing the final hours of a missing person. By then, memories have faded and details have become uncertain. Final sightings are often treated as anchors in a missing person investigation, but they can also become sources of uncertainty. Witnesses may disagree about times, appearances, or behaviour. Different people can interpret the same event in completely different ways. In the cases of Asher Degree and Patricia Meehan, witnesses provided valuable information that helped establish timelines. Yet those same timelines ultimately highlighted how little was known about what happened afterward. The sightings marked the boundary between confirmed facts and unanswered questions. Everything beyond that boundary remains uncertain. Every highway stop exists for a simple purpose: to help travellers continue their journey. Rest areas provide temporary refuge from long drives. Service stations offer fuel and supplies. Pull-offs allow motorists to pause before continuing onward. Most people pass through these locations without giving them a second thought. Yet for investigators examining disappearances, these places sometimes become the last known point in a person's story. They represent moments when someone was still visible, still moving, still connected to the world around them. Then, almost without warning, the trail ends. Roadside mysteries occupy a unique place among missing person cases because they combine visibility with uncertainty. Witnesses exist, locations are known, timelines can often be partially reconstructed. The missing person is not hidden deep within an unknown wilderness or lost in a place beyond observation. Instead, they vanish from environments specifically designed to serve the public. That contradiction is part of what makes these cases so compelling. The circumstances suggest that answers should exist, yet the answers remain elusive. Somewhere beyond those brief stops beside the highway, the people at the centre of these cases continued into a distance that no witness was able to follow. Brandon Swanson and the phone call that went silent. For 47 minutes, Brandon Swanson was not missing at all. He was speaking with his parents. His voice was travelling across a cell phone connection through the darkness of rural Minnesota, describing where he thought he was, where he planned to go, and how he intended to get home. Unlike most missing person cases, there was no sudden break in communication that left investigators struggling to reconstruct the final hours afterward. Brandon's final known movements unfolded almost in real time. Every step seemed to bring him closer to safety. Every minute of conversation appeared to narrow the distance between him and the people trying to find him. Then, without warning, the call ended, and one of the most perplexing disappearances in modern American history began. Graduation celebrations filled the evening before Brandon Swanson began the drive that would make his name known across the country. On May 13, 2008, the 19-year-old had attended celebrations marking his completion of coursework at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. Friends and family later described the evening as normal and enjoyable. Brandon spent time with friends and eventually began driving home during the late-night hours. His destination was Marshall, Minnesota, where his family lived. The route involved travelling through a region of southwestern Minnesota known for its farmland, gravel roads, drainage ditches, and small communities separated by long stretches of open countryside. It was an area Brandon knew well. Somewhere along the rural roads of southwestern Minnesota, a simple navigation mistake altered the course of the night. Shortly after midnight on May 14th, Brandon's vehicle left the roadway and became stuck in a ditch. The crash was minor. He was not injured and remained able to use his phone. Believing he knew his location, Brandon called his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, and explained the situation. He told them that his car was stuck and asked them to come pick him up. At that moment, the problem seemed manageable. A vehicle had become stranded. His parents would arrive, the situation would be resolved. None of the people involved had any reason to suspect that they were entering the final known chapter of Brandon's life. Rather than panic after his vehicle became stuck, Brandon reached for the solution most stranded drivers would choose. Throughout the conversation, he remained calm and cooperative. He believed he had accurately identified his location and provided directions based on that assumption. His parents immediately set out to find him. The confidence Brandon displayed during the calls would later become one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. He seemed certain he knew where he was. Investigators would eventually discover that he was mistaken. Miles away, his parents followed directions that seemed clear until they discovered they were searching in the wrong place. Brian and Annette drove toward the area Brandon described, expecting to locate his vehicle along the roadside. They repeatedly flashed their headlights, hoping he would see them. Brandon also reported seeing lights in the distance, yet despite remaining on the phone, neither side could locate the other. The longer the search continued, the stranger the situation became. Brandon insisted he could see lights. His parents insisted they were where he had directed them to go. Both observations appeared true, yet they failed to connect. Unknown to everyone involved, Brandon's actual location was miles away from where he believed himself to be. While waiting for help, Brandon decided not to remain beside the vehicle. He told his parents that he would leave the car and begin walking toward what he believed was the nearby town of Lind, Minnesota. From his perspective, the decision made sense. Rather than waiting beside a stranded vehicle, he would simply walk toward visible lights and meet his parents along the way. Throughout this process, he stayed connected by phone. The call became a lifeline linking Brandon to the outside world. Every few minutes he updated his parents about what he was seeing. He crossed fields and moved through the darkness while continuing the conversation. For investigators studying the case years later, this extended phone call would become one of the most unusual aspects of the entire disappearance. Lights visible in the distance convinced him that a familiar destination was closer than it actually was. Brandon continued walking across farmland rather than following established roads. The terrain consisted of agricultural fields, drainage systems, fences, streams, and other obstacles that were difficult to navigate at night. Yet he remained optimistic. According to accounts of the call, he joked with his parents at times and showed little indication that he believed himself to be in serious danger. The conversation created a sense of reassurance. Unlike a missing person whose whereabouts are completely unknown, Brandon seemed actively engaged in solving his own problem. His parents could hear his voice. He could hear theirs. The situation appeared to be moving toward a resolution. Unlike many missing person cases, the final stage of Brandon's journey unfolded in real time. For approximately 47 minutes, communication continued without interruption. During that period, Brandon described crossing fields and moving through the landscape. His parents listened as he progressed toward what he believed was safety. The duration of the call has always stood out to investigators because it provided such an unusually long window into a missing person's final movements. Most disappearances leave behind fragments. Brandon's case left behind nearly an hour of direct communication. Yet despite that advantage, the mystery proved no easier to solve. Everything investigators know about the disappearance ultimately converges on a single moment. According to his parents, Brandon suddenly exclaimed, "Oh shit!" The phrase was followed by silence. The call did not gradually fade. It did not end after a farewell, it stopped abruptly. Brian and Annette repeatedly called back, hoping Brandon would answer. The phone continued ringing for a period of time, suggesting it remained powered on. Eventually, however, all communication ceased. The final words created endless speculation. Had Brandon fallen? Had he encountered water? Had he unexpectedly come upon an obstacle in the darkness? No definitive answer has ever been established. Before sunrise, concern had already transformed into an organised search effort. Family members, law enforcement agencies, volunteers, and specialised search teams began examining the area. Investigators first focused on the location Brandon believed he occupied. When evidence revealed that he had actually been elsewhere, the search expanded dramatically. Authorities eventually located Brandon's vehicle near Taunton, Minnesota, confirming that he had misidentified his location during the calls. The discovery explained why his parents had been unable to find him. It did not explain what happened after the call ended. Fields, gravel roads, drainage ditches, rivers, and abandoned farm sites complicated the task of finding a single person. Searchers examined extensive areas surrounding the location where Brandon's vehicle had been found. Helicopters, tracking dogs, and numerous volunteers participated in efforts to locate him. Particular attention focused on the Yellow Medicine River and nearby waterways because of the possibility that Brandon had encountered one while walking through the darkness. Over the years, searches continued and expanded. Yet despite the extraordinary amount of effort devoted to the investigation, no confirmed trace of Brandon was discovered. The absence of evidence became increasingly difficult to understand. Someone had been moving through the landscape while actively speaking on the phone, then he disappeared completely. Years later, the mystery remains remarkable not because of how little information exists, but because of how much exists without providing an answer. Investigators know where Brandon started his drive. They know where his vehicle was found. They know approximately how long he walked. They know he remained on the phone with his parents for nearly an hour. They know the exact phrase he uttered before communication ended. Few missing person cases possess such a detailed timeline, yet those details have not resolved the mystery. Instead, they have highlighted the gap between what is known and what remains unknown. The case has attracted widespread attention because it challenges expectations about how disappearances occur. Most people assume that maintaining contact with family members reduces uncertainty. In Brandon's case, the opposite occurred. The phone call provided a remarkable amount of information while still failing to reveal the outcome. It allowed investigators to listen to the disappearance unfold without understanding how it ended. Every new examination of the evidence returns to the same question. What happened immediately after those final words? The call lasted long enough for Brandon Swanson to describe where he thought he was going, but not long enough for anyone to learn where he actually disappeared. The highway that became a corridor of missing people. Certain roads acquire reputations that have little to do with the destinations marked on their signs. Travellers may know them for the scenery, the distance they cover, or the communities they connect. Yet a small number become associated with something more unsettling. Stories begin to accumulate. Families remember names. Investigators revisit old files. New disappearances are measured against older ones. Over time, the road itself becomes part of the conversation. Not because it causes what happens there, but because so many unanswered questions seem to gather along the same stretch of pavement. Few examples illustrate the phenomenon more clearly than the corridor that came to be known as the Highway of Tears. Stretching across northern British Columbia, Highway 16 passes through some of the most sparsely populated landscapes in Canada. The route extends for hundreds of miles through forests, mountains, valleys, and remote communities separated by long distances. Services can be limited. Public transportation has historically been sparse in certain areas. For many residents, especially those living in smaller communities, hitchhiking became a practical means of travel despite the obvious risks. The highway connects towns such as Prince George, Smithers, Burns Lake, and Prince Rupert, carrying commercial traffic and local travellers through terrain that can feel vast and isolated even during daylight hours. The beauty of the region is undeniable, but so is its remoteness. Concern did not arrive suddenly along this highway. It accumulated one disappearance at a time. Over the years, reports emerged involving women and girls who vanished while travelling along or near Highway 16. Some cases involved confirmed abductions. Others began with missing person reports that produced few immediate answers. The incidents did not initially appear connected. Each family confronted its own investigation, its own search, and its own uncertainty. Yet as the number of cases grew, communities began noticing similarities. Many of the missing were Indigenous women and girls. Many disappeared while attempting to travel between communities. The distances involved and the lack of witnesses often complicated investigations from the very beginning. As the years passed, similarities between separate investigations became increasingly difficult to ignore. Families, community advocates, journalists, and law enforcement agencies all began examining whether the disappearances represented more than a series of isolated incidents. Public awareness grew as additional names were added to the list of those who vanished along the corridor. Some cases were eventually linked to criminal activity, while others remained unresolved. The emerging pattern transformed Highway 16 from an ordinary transportation route into a symbol of a much larger issue involving vulnerability, geography, and the challenges of investigating crimes in remote areas. Among the names remembered along the corridor is Monica Jack, whose disappearance shocked communities far beyond the region. In May 1978, 12-year-old Monica disappeared from the Nicola Lake area of British Columbia. Although her case was not directly tied to the Highway of Tears corridor itself, it later became part of broader discussions surrounding missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the province. Decades passed before investigators achieved a significant breakthrough. In 2014, a DNA match linked former ranch hand Gary Handlin to the crime, and he was eventually convicted. The long delay between the disappearance and the conviction demonstrated how difficult some of these investigations could become. For families waiting for answers, years often turned into decades. Another case followed in 1994 when Ramona Wilson vanished after leaving a community gathering. Ramona was 15 years old and lived in Smithers, British Columbia. She disappeared after attending a dance and was reportedly planning to hitchhike home. The following year, her remains were discovered near Smithers Airport. The case became one of the most frequently cited examples associated with the Highway of Tears. Ramona's disappearance highlighted the vulnerability of young people attempting to travel through regions where transportation options were limited. It also reinforced concerns that dangerous individuals could take advantage of those circumstances while leaving behind very little evidence. By the early 21st century, the pattern had become impossible for many observers to dismiss as coincidence. In 2002, 25-year-old Nicole Hoare disappeared while hitchhiking from Prince George to Smithers. She had recently moved to the area and was travelling to visit family. Witnesses reported seeing her standing near Highway 16. Then, she vanished. Despite extensive searches and widespread publicity, no confirmed trace of her was found. Nicole's case attracted significant national attention and introduced a new generation of Canadians to the growing concern surrounding the highway. For many people unfamiliar with the region, it served as a stark introduction to a problem that local communities had been discussing for years. Distance shapes life along Highway 16 in ways that are difficult to appreciate from a map alone. A journey between communities may require travelling through large stretches of wilderness with few services available in between. Weather conditions can change rapidly. Cell phone coverage has historically been inconsistent in some areas. These factors do not explain the disappearances, but they influence the environment in which they occur. A person attempting to travel from one town to another may encounter circumstances very different from those found in more densely populated regions. Investigators searching for missing persons must contend with vast search areas, limited witnesses, and terrain capable of concealing evidence for years. Multiple police agencies eventually found themselves examining cases separated by years, locations, and circumstances. Efforts to determine whether certain disappearances were connected produced complex results. Some investigations eventually led to arrests and convictions. Others remained unresolved despite extensive work. One of the most significant developments occurred when serial offender Bobby Jack Fowler was linked through DNA evidence to the murders of several women associated with the Highway of Tears investigations. The discovery provided answers in some cases, yet it did not explain every disappearance linked to the corridor. Instead, it demonstrated that multiple offenders and multiple circumstances may have contributed to the broader pattern. Families of the missing refused to allow the disappearances to fade quietly into the past. Vigils, awareness campaigns, memorial events, and advocacy efforts became an important part of the public response. Relatives repeatedly emphasized that the individuals at the center of these cases were more than statistics. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends whose absences continued to affect entire communities. Public pressure helped keep attention focused on unresolved investigations, while also encouraging broader discussions about transportation access, public safety, and the treatment of Indigenous women and girls within the criminal justice system. Even after arrests and breakthroughs in some investigations, many questions remained unresolved. Certain disappearances could not be conclusively linked to known offenders. Other cases lacked sufficient evidence to determine exactly what happened. The passage of time complicated matters further. Witness memories faded, physical evidence deteriorated. Investigators faced the challenge of revisiting events that occurred years or even decades earlier. Despite these difficulties, efforts to seek answers continued. Every breakthrough demonstrated that old cases could still yield new information, even when hope appeared to be diminishing. Today, the highway continues to carry travelers through the same forests, valleys, and communities that witnessed decades of uncertainty. Vehicles move along the route every day. Residents continue to live, work, and travel throughout the region. Yet the stories associated with the Highway of Tears remain deeply embedded in public memory. The corridor has become more than a transportation route. It has become a reminder of lives interrupted, investigations prolonged, and families left searching for explanations. The road itself offers no answers. It simply stretches onward through the landscape, connecting places while carrying the weight of a history that many people refuse to forget. Unlike the mysteries explored in earlier chapters, this story does not centre on a single disappearance, a single vehicle, or a single moment of lost contact. Instead, it revolves around accumulation. One case becomes two becomes several. Eventually, a pattern emerges that changes how an entire region understands a stretch of highway. The mystery is not found in one unanswered question, but in the persistence of many questions spread across decades. For some families, the journey along that road never truly ended, because the answers they were searching for never arrived at the same destination, the drivers who vanished within sight of help. Distance often defines missing person cases, yet the mysteries in this chapter are measured by how little distance remained. In many missing person investigations, authorities are forced to search vast wilderness areas, reconstruct uncertain timelines, or explain why someone entered a dangerous situation in the first place. The cases in this chapter present a different problem. The people at the centre of these mysteries were not isolated from the world. They were not weeks away from rescue or lost in places beyond communication. In each instance, assistance seemed remarkably close. Family members were waiting, towns were nearby, roads remained within reach. Yet despite that proximity, the missing person vanished before help could arrive. Investigators often spend years searching for answers hidden within distances that can be measured in minutes rather than miles. A person may be only a short walk from a roadway, a home, or a passing vehicle when something happens that permanently interrupts their journey. The shorter the distance appears, the more frustrating the mystery becomes. It is difficult to accept that someone can disappear while seemingly so close to safety. Yet this pattern appears repeatedly in missing person investigations. The details change from case to case, but the contradiction remains the same. Rescue feels imminent. Then the trail ends. In August 2013, Bryce Laspisa's movements suggested that reaching home should have been only a matter of time. The 19-year-old college student had spent the day driving south through California. As the trip progressed, however, unusual behaviour began attracting concern from friends and family. Bryce remained in contact with his parents, Karen and Michael Laspisa, who became increasingly worried about his condition. Throughout the day and evening, various interactions suggested that something was wrong, though no one could determine exactly what. The situation escalated slowly rather than dramatically. There was no sudden disappearance. Instead, there was a growing sense that Bryce needed assistance. Communication with family members confirmed that help was not far away. At one point, Bryce remained parked for hours near Buttonwillow, California. Concerned by reports about his condition, his parents contacted authorities and attempted to intervene. Law enforcement officers encountered Bryce and reportedly concluded that he appeared coherent enough to continue his journey. Afterward, he resumed driving south. His parents remained in contact, believing that he would soon arrive home. Every update reinforced the impression that the situation, while unusual, remained manageable. Bryce was not missing. His location was known. The distance between him and his family continued to shrink. Near Castaic Lake, the situation changed from unusual to deeply mysterious. During the early morning hours of August 30, 2013, Bryce's Toyota Highlander left the roadway near the lake and rolled down an embankment. The crash caused significant damage to the vehicle, yet investigators concluded that Bryce had survived the accident. Blood found at the scene was minimal, and evidence suggested he had exited the vehicle afterward. Search efforts quickly focused on the surrounding area. The circumstances created an unsettling contradiction. Bryce had survived the crash. Help was close, yet he was nowhere to be found. Extensive searches failed to produce the straightforward explanation many expected. Law enforcement agencies, search teams and volunteers examined areas around Castaic Lake. Divers searched nearby waters. Investigators followed leads and analysed evidence recovered from the vehicle. Despite those efforts, Bryce remained missing. Years later, the case continues to generate attention because of the peculiar combination of known facts and unanswered questions. His vehicle was found. The crash was documented. The area was searched. Yet the final movements that followed his escape from the wreck remain unknown. A similar contradiction emerged years later on a rural road in Texas. On December 13, 2020, 21-year-old Jason Landry left San Marcos, Texas, intending to drive home to Missouri City. During the trip, his Nissan Altima left the roadway near Luling and crashed through a fence. Investigators later found the vehicle in a remote area. At first glance, the situation resembled many roadside accidents. Yet as authorities examined the scene, they encountered details that transformed it into a missing person case. Evidence at the scene suggested that Jason Landry had survived the crash itself. Personal belongings were scattered around the area. Clothing, personal items, and evidence indicating activity after the collision were discovered near the vehicle. Search teams responded quickly. The location was not completely isolated. Roads remained nearby. Assistance should not have been impossibly far away. Yet despite extensive searches involving drones, tracking dogs, volunteers, and law enforcement personnel, Jason was not found. The crash site marked the point where certainty ended. Everything beyond it remained unclear. Brandon Lawson's disappearance introduced another version of the same troubling pattern. Unlike Bryce Laspisa or Jason Landry, Brandon was actively communicating with family members after his vehicle became stranded along a highway in West Texas. He was not alone in the sense that many missing people are alone. His brother was attempting to reach him. His location appeared roughly known. Communication continued through phone calls. Assistance seemed close enough to be measured not in hours but in minutes. Yet the outcome proved no less mysterious. Measured on a map, none of these individuals seemed particularly far from assistance. Bryce's family knew he was travelling toward home. Jason's crash occurred within a region that investigators could quickly search. Brandon remained connected to family members through a live phone conversation. Each situation contained elements that should have increased the likelihood of a safe outcome. Instead, those same elements deepened the mystery. The expectation of rescue became part of what made the disappearances so difficult to understand. What separates these cases from many other disappearances is the persistent sense that the outcome should have been different. Human intuition expects proximity to matter. We assume that someone who is close to help has a greater chance of being found. We assume that a known location provides investigators with an advantage. We assume that a stranded driver will eventually encounter assistance. In these cases, those assumptions proved unreliable. The roads were known, the timelines were partially understood, the opportunities for rescue appeared real, yet the disappearances still occurred. Each investigation eventually arrives at the same unanswered question. What happened during the final moments before safety should have been reached? Investigators can often reconstruct much of the journey. They can identify where the vehicle stopped. They can determine who was contacted and when. They can establish search areas and review witness accounts. What remains missing is the final transition, the moment when a stranded driver should have moved from danger toward assistance. That missing piece transforms ordinary roadside incidents into enduring mysteries. These cases also reveal how quickly circumstances can change. A person may survive a crash, remain in communication, or stand within reach of a road and still disappear. The difference between safety and uncertainty can be remarkably small. A few minutes, a short walk, a decision made under difficult conditions. Those small intervals become enormous when viewed through the lens of an unresolved investigation. They represent distances that search teams, families, and investigators have spent years attempting to cross without success. The people searching for them eventually found the roads, the vehicles, and the evidence, but never the final steps that should have led them to safety. Maura Murray and the roadside mystery. Most missing person investigations begin with uncertainty, but this one begins with a timeline that appears almost complete. Investigators know where the journey started. They know where the vehicle stopped. They know who saw the driver after the crash. They know roughly when law enforcement arrived. The gap separating those events is measured in minutes rather than hours or days. Yet within that narrow interval lies one of the most debated disappearances in American history. More than 2 decades later, countless theories have emerged, extensive searches have been conducted, and investigators have revisited the evidence repeatedly. Still, the most important question remains unanswered. How did someone disappear from a roadside scene that should have been far easier to explain? Before her name became associated with one of America's most debated disappearances, Maura Murray appeared to be building an ambitious future. Born in Massachusetts, she excelled academically and athletically. She attended the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point before transferring to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she studied nursing. Friends and family described her as intelligent, determined, and independent. Like many young adults, she was navigating the pressures and uncertainties that accompany college life. Nothing about her background suggested that she would eventually become the centre of a mystery that would attract nationwide attention and remain unresolved for decades. Days before the crash, a series of decisions quietly altered the direction of Maura's routine. On February 9, 2004, she sent emails indicating that she would be away from school for several days because of a family emergency. Investigators later found no evidence that such an emergency actually existed. She also withdrew a substantial portion of the money from her bank account and purchased alcohol before leaving Amherst. These actions would later become the subject of intense scrutiny. Were they signs of a planned trip, an attempt to get away temporarily, evidence of a personal crisis? At the time, they appeared to be the ordinary decisions of a college student preparing to travel. On February 9, 2004, she left Amherst and headed north. The exact destination remains uncertain. Investigators discovered directions among her belongings related to locations in northern New Hampshire and Vermont. The drive carried her away from the university and toward a region known for its forests, mountains, and winding roads. At some point during the journey, her Saturn sedan entered the White Mountains region of New Hampshire. Whether she intended to stay for several days or was simply exploring possibilities remains unclear. What is known is that by evening, her route brought her to a rural section of Route 112 near the town of Haverhill. Winter had already settled over the White Mountains by the time her journey reached rural New Hampshire. Snow covered much of the surrounding landscape, and darkness arrived early across the mountainous terrain. Route 112 wound through the region, connecting small communities separated by stretches of forest and open land. The road was not deserted, but neither was it heavily travelled. Residents living nearby were accustomed to quiet evenings, interrupted only occasionally by passing vehicles. It was in this setting, far from Amherst, and far from anyone expecting to see her, that the mystery began. Evidence of the collision remained visible long after the driver had vanished. At approximately 7:27 p.m, a local resident reported a single vehicle accident along Route 112. Maura's Saturn had left the roadway and struck a snowbank near a sharp curve. The crash appeared relatively minor. Damage to the vehicle was noticeable but not catastrophic. Investigators later found personal belongings inside the car, along with some of the alcohol she had purchased earlier. The scene suggested an accident, not a disappearance. Yet almost immediately, details emerged that would transform it into something far more puzzling. Across the road, a local resident became one of the last people known to have spoken with Maura. School bus driver Butch Atwood had driven past the crash scene and stopped to check on the driver. According to his account, he briefly spoke with Maura and offered assistance. She reportedly declined help and told him that she had already contacted roadside assistance. Atwood later stated that he found this explanation unusual because cell phone service in the area was unreliable. Nevertheless, he returned to his home and contacted authorities to report the accident. The interaction lasted only a short time, but it would become one of the most significant witness accounts in the entire investigation. Between the witness account and the arrival of law enforcement lies the narrow interval that defines the entire case. After speaking with Atwood, Maura remained near the vehicle. A short time later, police arrived at the crash scene. The Saturn was still there. Maura was not. The gap between those two observations has been estimated at only a matter of minutes. There was no evidence that she had been picked up by a known acquaintance. No witness definitively reported seeing her leave, yet she was gone. Everything that followed would revolve around this brief period of time. Investigators could reconstruct much of the day leading up to the crash. They could not reconstruct the moments immediately afterward. Search teams expected the surrounding landscape to provide clues, but the terrain offered remarkably little. Authorities quickly initiated search efforts focused on the area surrounding Route 112. Search dogs were brought in to track Maura's scent. According to reports, one scent trail appeared to continue along the roadway for a short distance before ending. The result generated immediate speculation. Some interpreted it as evidence that she entered another vehicle. Others cautioned against drawing firm conclusions from a single scent track. Regardless of interpretation, the searchers failed to produce definitive evidence. No confirmed trace of Maura was found in the nearby woods, fields, or surrounding terrain. Few missing person investigations have generated as many competing explanations as this one. Some theories suggest that Maura voluntarily disappeared and started a new life elsewhere. Others propose that she succumbed to the elements after leaving the roadway. Additional theories focus on the possibility of foul play, suggesting that she encountered someone after the crash. Each explanation attempts to account for the available evidence, yet each also encounters significant challenges. A voluntary disappearance would require successfully avoiding detection for decades. An accident in the surrounding wilderness would need to explain the absence of physical evidence despite extensive searches. Foul play theories must account for the extraordinarily brief window in which such an encounter could have occurred. Public fascination with the case has persisted for reasons that extend beyond the disappearance itself. The mystery emerged during a period when online communities dedicated to unsolved cases were growing rapidly. Discussion forums, podcasts, documentaries, books, and independent investigations devoted enormous attention to the disappearance. New theories appeared regularly. Witness statements were re-examined, timelines were reconstructed repeatedly. The volume of discussion became so extensive that Maura Murray's case evolved into one of the most recognized missing person investigations in America. Yet despite the extraordinary attention, the central mystery remained unchanged. More than 2 decades later, the unanswered questions still converge on the same brief stretch of time. Investigators know where Maura spent the day. They know the route she travelled. They know where the vehicle crashed. They know that she spoke with Butch Atwood. They know when police arrived. The challenge lies within the space between those facts. It is a gap so small that many people assume it should already be understood. Instead, it remains the least understood part of the entire case. The roadside scene on Route 112 has become one of the most analysed locations in modern true crime history. Photographs have been studied. Witness timelines have been compared. Search methods have been debated. Every detail has been examined in the hope that a previously overlooked clue might finally explain what happened. Yet the passage of time has only emphasised how unusual the disappearance remains. The more investigators learn about the hours leading up to the crash, the more mysterious the minutes after it become. The road, the vehicle, and the timeline remain in place, but the minutes that followed the crash continue to lead investigators into the same silence that swallowed Maura Murray. When search dogs reached the road and stopped. Search dogs are brought into investigations for one reason: to continue a trail after every other clue has run out. Long before investigators discover physical evidence or identify credible witnesses, a trained tracking dog can sometimes provide direction where none previously existed. The animal follows an invisible path left behind by a missing person, moving through forests, fields, neighbourhoods, and open terrain that might otherwise reveal nothing at all. For families and search teams, those trails often represent hope in its most tangible form, yet some of the most frustrating missing person cases share a peculiar pattern. The trail begins clearly, progresses with purpose, and then reaches a road where it abruptly ends. A scent trail is rarely expected to solve an entire disappearance, but it can reveal the direction a missing person once travelled. Search and rescue teams have long relied on tracking dogs because of their remarkable ability to detect and follow human scent. Investigators understand that scent evidence is not perfect. Weather conditions, terrain, traffic, and the passage of time can all affect results. Even so, when multiple factors align and a dog follows a trail consistently, investigators pay close attention. An abruptly ending trail can suggest many possibilities. The person may have entered a vehicle, environmental factors may have disrupted the scent, or something else may have occurred entirely. The uncertainty surrounding those endings often becomes as important as the trail itself. Long before her case became one of the most discussed child disappearances in America, Asha Degree became the focus of an intensive search effort. On February 14, 2000, the 9-year-old disappeared from her family's home in Shelby, North Carolina. Witnesses later reported seeing a young girl walking along Highway 18 during the early morning hours. The sightings provided investigators with a direction of travel and transformed the search into a race against time. Search teams examined areas surrounding the highway, hoping to determine where Asha had gone after leaving the roadside. The case quickly grew into one of the largest missing child investigations in the region. Investigators hoped the surrounding landscape would preserve traces of her movements, yet certainty proved difficult to maintain. Search efforts extended into nearby wooded areas and locations connected to witness reports. Over time, investigators recovered items believed to be associated with Asha, including belongings found miles from where she was last seen. Those discoveries provided important clues, but failed to establish a complete sequence of events. While the investigation generated numerous leads, the evidence never produced a definitive explanation for what happened after Asha left the area where she'd been observed. The search revealed fragments of a journey, but not its conclusion. Years later, another New Hampshire disappearance would generate similar questions about a trail that appeared to end unexpectedly. When Maura Murray vanished after a crash on Route 112 in February 2004, investigators quickly launched search efforts in the surrounding area. The crash scene itself had already raised questions. The driver was gone, yet there was little evidence indicating where she had travelled after leaving the vehicle. Search dogs were brought in to assist investigators, offering the possibility that a scent trail might reveal her movements during the crucial minutes following the accident. What the search dogs indicated near Route 112 became almost as debated as the disappearance itself. According to reports, one scent trail appeared to continue eastward along the roadway for a short distance before ending. The result immediately attracted attention, because it suggested a possibility that investigators could neither confirm nor dismiss. If the scent truly ended at the roadside, some wondered whether Maura entered a passing vehicle. Others argued that environmental conditions or limitations associated with the search may have influenced the result. The debate has continued for years because the trail seemed to offer an answer while simultaneously creating new questions. Rather than resolving uncertainty, it expanded it. The effort to locate Brandon Swanson extended across farmland and waterways after his phone call ended. Unlike many disappearances, Brandon's final movements unfolded while he remained in contact with his parents. Search teams later focused on areas surrounding the location where investigators believed he had been walking. Fields, drainage ditches, rivers, and rural roads became part of an extensive search operation. The challenge was not identifying a broad area of interest. The challenge was determining what happened after communication stopped. Despite extensive searches, the terrain offered no straightforward explanation for where he had gone. Investigators examined waterways, agricultural land, and locations Brandon may have crossed while attempting to reach safety. Search dogs participated in various stages of the effort, helping search teams narrow areas of focus. Yet, like so many highway-related disappearances, the investigation eventually encountered a familiar problem. Evidence pointed toward movement. It suggested direction. What it did not reveal was the final destination. The trail moved investigators forward but stopped short of providing a conclusion. Road crossings occupy a peculiar place in missing person investigations. They represent transitions between one environment and another. A person moving through a forest eventually reaches a road. Someone crossing a field encounters a highway. A trail that can be followed through natural terrain may suddenly become difficult to track once it intersects with pavement, traffic, and countless overlapping scents. For investigators, these locations often become critical turning points. They are places where possibilities multiply rather than narrow. One possibility frequently considered by investigators involves a person entering a vehicle after reaching a roadway. This theory appears in numerous missing person investigations because it offers a straightforward explanation for why a trail might end abruptly. If someone accepted a ride, entered a vehicle voluntarily, or encountered another individual at a roadside location, the scent trail might cease to continue beyond that point. Yet investigators rarely treat such explanations as proven without additional evidence. A trail ending near a road can suggest a possibility, but it does not automatically confirm one. The distinction is important because roads are also places where scent evidence can become complicated by environmental conditions and heavy traffic. For families waiting for answers, a lost trail can feel as frustrating as the disappearance itself. Search dogs may provide the first promising lead in days. Investigators may finally believe they are moving closer to understanding what happened. Then the trail ends. The point where it ends becomes a new mystery. Family members revisit maps, timelines, and witness statements, searching for clues that might explain why the scent stopped where it did. In many cases, the road itself becomes one of the most intensely examined locations in the investigation. Every search begins with the hope that a path will lead somewhere meaningful. Search teams follow footprints, witness accounts, physical evidence, and scent trails because each offers a chance to move beyond uncertainty. Yet the cases of Asha Degree, Maura Murray, Brandon Swanson, and many others demonstrate that even promising trails can reach a point where they reveal no more. The dogs succeed in showing where a person travelled. The mystery begins when investigators attempt to determine what happened next. Unlike a vehicle, a phone call, or a witness statement, a scent trail feels dynamic. It creates the impression of movement. Investigators are not simply examining a scene, they are following someone. That sense of progress makes an ending trail particularly powerful. It suggests that the answer was once close enough to follow. Then, without warning, the path disappears into uncertainty. The search continues, but the strongest lead has already reached its limit. Each trail pointed somewhere specific, and then, at the edge of a roadway, pointed nowhere at all. The missing travellers who were never found. Every journey begins with an expectation so ordinary that most people never think about it. A destination is chosen, a route is followed, and eventually the traveller arrives. The process is so routine that it rarely attracts attention. Families expect a phone call, friends expect a visit, employers expect someone to show up for work. The assumption of arrival is built into every journey. Yet a small number of disappearances challenge that assumption completely. In these cases, the traveller leaves, the journey begins, and then the story simply stops. No final location is confirmed, no clear explanation emerges. The destination remains permanently empty. For some travellers, however, the destination becomes the first thing that never happens. Investigators often begin missing person cases with a location, a crash scene, an abandoned vehicle, a witness account. The disappearances explored in this chapter are different. They are defined by absence rather than discovery. The people involved set out on ordinary journeys with clear intentions. Then they vanish so completely that investigators struggle to determine not only what happened, but where the search should even begin. The mystery is not built around a clue, it is built around the lack of one. In October 1928, Glenn and Bessie Hyde launched a small boat into the Grand Canyon and entered one of America's oldest disappearance mysteries. The newly married couple had ambitious plans. Glenn Hyde hoped to set a speed record for navigating the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. The journey attracted attention because of both the challenge involved and the couple's unusual decision to undertake it together. They traveled through one of the most dramatic landscapes in North America, moving between towering canyon walls and powerful stretches of river. The expedition progressed successfully enough that observers along the route reported seeing them alive and apparently in good spirits. Days later, searchers found evidence that the voyage had continued, but not the people making it. The Hyde's boat was eventually discovered intact downstream. Supplies remained aboard. Equipment was present. Nothing immediately suggested a catastrophic accident, yet Glenn and Bessie themselves were gone. Search efforts examined the canyon and the river, but no definitive trace of either person was found. The circumstances created an enduring mystery. If the boat survived, what happened to the couple? If they left the vessel intentionally, where did they go? The Grand Canyon offered countless possibilities and almost no certainty. The absence of clear answers allowed the story to survive far beyond the era in which it began. Over the decades, numerous theories emerged. Some proposed that the Hydes drowned after leaving the boat. Others suggested foul play. Additional speculation focused on the possibility that one or both survived and disappeared intentionally. The mystery became intertwined with Grand Canyon folklore, attracting historians, investigators, and amateur researchers alike. Yet despite decades of interest, no explanation has ever achieved broad acceptance. The river journey remains frozen in time, ending at a point where the evidence simply stops. More than 3 decades later, another journey would disappear under very different circumstances. Michael Rockefeller, the 23-year-old son of New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, travelled to what was then Netherlands, New Guinea in 1961. He had developed a strong interest in anthropology and indigenous art, and was participating in an expedition focused on collecting artifacts and documenting local cultures. The journey took him far from the highways and communities familiar to most travellers, placing him instead among coastal waterways and remote settlements. By all accounts, he was enthusiastic about the work and deeply engaged in the expedition. Faced with an emergency off the coast of New Guinea, Michael Rockefeller made a decision that became his final known action. On November 18, 1961, the catamaran carrying Rockefeller and his companions encountered trouble offshore. The vessel overturned, leaving those aboard stranded in the water. After hours without rescue, Rockefeller reportedly decided to swim towards shore. According to accounts from the expedition, he believed land was within reach and announced his intention before entering the water. It was the last confirmed sighting of him. The shoreline lay ahead. The destination appeared visible, yet he never arrived in any documented way. Despite extensive efforts involving aircraft, boats, and local searchers, certainty remained elusive. Search operations covered large sections of coastline and surrounding waters. International attention quickly followed because of Rockefeller's family name and the unusual circumstances of the disappearance. Numerous theories emerged. Some suggested he drowned while attempting to reach shore. Others proposed that he successfully reached land and later encountered danger. Theories involving local communities and cultural conflicts attracted particular attention, though definitive proof remained elusive. Like the Hyde disappearance decades earlier, the investigation generated possibilities without producing a universally accepted conclusion. What happened to Jason Jolkowski remains remarkable because of how little distance separated him from his destination. On June 13, 2001, the 19-year-old Omaha resident received a call from a co-worker offering him a ride to work. The arrangement was simple. Jason would walk a short distance from his home to meet the vehicle at a nearby school. The trip required only a few minutes. He left the house and began the walk. Unlike many missing person cases, there was no complicated travel route, no remote wilderness, and no lengthy timeline to reconstruct. The journey should have been straightforward. The walk should have lasted only a few minutes. When the co-worker arrived, Jason was not there. Attempts to contact him failed. Family members soon realized that something was wrong. Investigators examined the route between Jason's home and the meeting location. The distance was short enough that he should have remained within a familiar residential environment for the entire trip. Yet despite extensive investigation, no confirmed trace of him was found. No verified sightings established where he went after leaving home. The disappearance became one of Nebraska's most enduring mysteries, precisely because the missing distance was so small. The journey was measured in blocks rather than miles. Unlike many missing person investigations, these cases are defined more by absence than discovery. Glenn and Bessie Hyde left behind a boat but little explanation. Michael Rockefeller left behind an overturned vessel and unanswered questions. Jason Jolkowski left behind almost nothing at all beyond a planned meeting that never occurred. Investigators searching these cases encountered a common challenge. There was no obvious scene that explained the disappearance. Instead, there were only incomplete journeys and destinations that remained forever unreached. The farther investigators looked into each disappearance, the less complete the story became. Searches expanded. Witnesses were interviewed. Theories developed. Yet each new possibility revealed the same fundamental problem. The travellers had vanished before the narrative could reach its conclusion. The evidence documented departures. It documented intentions. In some cases, it even documented the route itself. What it could not document was the final chapter. These mysteries remain compelling because they challenge one of the most basic assumptions people make about travel. We expect movement to create a trail. We expect destinations to provide answers. We expect that if enough effort is applied, a missing route can eventually be reconstructed. Yet the disappearances of Glenn and Bessie Hyde, Michael Rockefeller, and Jason Jolkowski suggest otherwise. Sometimes a journey can begin normally, proceed as expected, and still end in a place where certainty never arrives. The journeys were different, the destinations were different, and the years were different. Yet each traveller left behind the same unanswered question. Where did the road beyond the known story actually lead? Asher Degree and the child seen walking on the highway. Headlights reveal countless ordinary things along a highway at night, but occasionally they illuminate something that should not be there at all. A stranded vehicle, a deer crossing the road, or a person walking along the shoulder may briefly enter the beam before disappearing into darkness again. Most of those moments are forgotten almost immediately. One sighting from the early hours of February 14, 2000 was not. More than 2 decades later, investigators, journalists, and the public continue returning to the same unsettling image. A young child walking alone beside a North Carolina highway before dawn. The sight was unusual when it happened. It became even more mysterious after nobody could explain where she was going or what happened after she disappeared from view. Inside the Degree family home, the evening of February 13th, 2000, appeared entirely unremarkable. Asher Degree lived in Shelby, North Carolina, with her parents Harold and Akila Degree and her older brother O'Brien. By all accounts, she was a normal 9-year-old girl. Family members described her as responsible, intelligent, and close to those around her. She attended school, participated in activities, and lived within a stable family environment. Nothing about the household suggested the beginning of a disappearance that would become one of the most discussed unsolved child cases in America. The night unfolded like countless others before it. Hours passed without incident before the mystery quietly began sometime after midnight. Weather conditions had deteriorated as a storm moved through the area. Rain and strong winds affected parts of Shelby during the night. Inside the house, family members went to sleep. At some point during the early morning hours of February 14th, however, something changed. Investigators later concluded that Asher left her bedroom and departed the house while everyone else remained asleep. The exact time remains uncertain, but evidence suggests she left sometime after 2:30 a.m. and before dawn. It was an extraordinary action for a child her age, particularly under such conditions. Evidence later suggested that Asher had not simply wandered outside on impulse. Investigators determined that she appeared to have taken personal belongings with her before leaving. Reports indicated that she packed items into a backpack before departing. This detail immediately complicated the investigation. A child stepping outside briefly would be one thing. A child leaving home with possessions suggested planning. Yet no convincing explanation has ever emerged regarding why she would choose to leave in the middle of a stormy night. Family members consistently stated that there were no known circumstances that would explain such a decision. The question became one of the central mysteries in the case, and remains unresolved to this day. Several miles from home, motorists travelling along Highway 18 reported a sight that would later become central to the investigation. During the early morning darkness, drivers observed what appeared to be a young girl walking beside the roadway. The reports initially seemed unusual, but not necessarily connected to a missing person case. Only later, after investigators began searching for Asher, did the significance become clear. The witness accounts placed a child matching her description along the highway several miles from her home. Unlike many disappearances that lack eyewitness observations, this case contained multiple reports suggesting that Asher had indeed been walking alone beside a major road before dawn. One witness became concerned enough to turn his vehicle around and look again. According to accounts later provided to investigators, a truck driver initially believed he was seeing a small adult walking along the roadside. As he passed, however, something about the sight troubled him. He turned around to take another look. When he approached, the individual reportedly moved away from the roadway and disappeared into a wooded area nearby. The behaviour was unusual. Rather than seeking help from passing motorists, the child appeared to avoid contact. This detail has remained one of the most puzzling aspects of the witness accounts. If Asher was attempting to reach a destination, why avoid someone who might have offered assistance? By the time daylight arrived, the search had already become a race against uncertainty. Family members discovered that Asher was missing and quickly contacted authorities. Law enforcement officers responded and began organising search efforts. The case rapidly attracted attention because of Asher's age and the unusual circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Search teams examined areas near her home and locations connected to witness sightings along Highway 18. Volunteers joined the effort. Investigators attempted to reconstruct her movements. Every hour that passed increased concern because the weather conditions had been poor and the child remained unaccounted for. Among the earliest discoveries were items that appeared to place Asher near the route described by witnesses. During the search, investigators located candy wrappers and other objects in an area near a shed along Highway 18. The discovery attracted attention because it seemed consistent with the possibility that Asher had temporarily sought shelter there after leaving the roadway. The location sat near the area where witnesses reported seeing a child move into the darkness. Searchers hoped the findings would provide a clearer picture of her route. Instead, they raised additional questions. Why had she entered the area? How long had she remained there? And where had she gone afterward? More than a year after the disappearance, investigators received a clue from an entirely different location. In August 2001, construction workers in Burke County, North Carolina, discovered Asher's backpack buried inside plastic bags. The location was roughly 26 miles from Shelby. The discovery represented one of the most significant developments in the entire investigation. Authorities confirmed that the backpack belonged to Asher, but the circumstances surrounding its placement remained deeply puzzling. Someone had apparently transported it far from the original search area. The finding expanded the mystery geographically while simultaneously suggesting that another individual may have been involved in the disappearance. Few unsolved cases generate as much debate as those that appear to contain both witnesses and missing answers. Investigators possess evidence indicating that Asha left home. Witnesses reported seeing a child matching her description along Highway 18. Items connected to the disappearance were recovered. Her backpack was eventually found miles away. Yet despite these developments, no definitive explanation has emerged. Some theories suggest that she intended to meet someone. Others focus on the possibility that she encountered danger after leaving the roadway. Additional speculation examines whether an unknown individual may have influenced her actions before she disappeared. Each theory attempts to explain certain aspects of the case, while leaving other questions unresolved. Decades of investigation have produced important developments without delivering a final explanation. Law enforcement agencies have repeatedly revisited the case, releasing new information and pursuing fresh leads. Public interest has remained unusually strong because the disappearance contains elements rarely found together in a single investigation. There are witnesses, there is physical evidence, there is a partially reconstructed timeline, yet the central mystery remains intact. The known facts establish portions of the journey without revealing its conclusion. Each new development appears to bring investigators closer to understanding what happened, only for the trail to become uncertain again. The passage of time has not diminished the impact of the case on the community or on Asha's family. Annual appeals for information continue. Investigators maintain that the case remains active. The mystery persists not because there is no evidence, but because the available evidence points in multiple directions without fully connecting. The backpack, the witness sightings, the roadside discoveries, and the timeline all seem significant. None of them explain why a 9-year-old child left home during a storm and walked into the darkness. Every known fact eventually circles back to the same image reported during the early morning darkness. A highway stretches through the night. Rain falls. Vehicles pass through the beam of their headlights. Along the roadside, a young girl continues walking. Witnesses see her. Investigators confirm the reports. The image stands as one of the most credible and haunting moments in the entire case because it captures a disappearance in progress without explaining where it was leading. Everything before that moment can be partially reconstructed. Everything after it remains unknown. The witnesses saw a child walking into the night, but what happened after she disappeared beyond their headlights remains one of the most haunting unanswered questions on any American highway. The last call's made from the road. A telephone call is supposed to close the distance between two people, not become the final record of one of them. Most conversations are forgotten almost as soon as they end. Plans are made, questions are answered, and daily life moves forward. In missing person investigations, however, an ordinary conversation can take on extraordinary significance. A casual remark becomes evidence. A routine exchange becomes a timeline. Every word is examined because it may represent the last known connection to someone who vanished. The mysteries in this chapter are unusual because investigators did not begin with silence. They began with voices. The silence came afterward. Unlike physical evidence, a conversation captures a disappearance while it is still unfolding. A vehicle can reveal where a journey ended. A witness can describe what was seen. A phone call occupies a different space. It preserves thoughts, observations, and decisions in real time. Investigators are able to hear what the missing person heard, understand what they were thinking, and sometimes even identify what concerned them in the final moments before they disappeared. Yet conversations have limitations. They reveal only what is said. Everything outside the call remains hidden. That contradiction has made final phone calls some of the most compelling and frustrating forms of evidence in missing person investigations. On the evening of April 4th, 1991, Angela Hammond stopped at a payphone in Clinton, Missouri to call her boyfriend. The 20-year-old had spent part of the evening with friends before making the call from a payphone near a grocery store parking lot. Nothing about the situation appeared unusual. Angela and her boyfriend Rob Schaefer spoke regularly. The conversation was casual and unhurried. She remained at the phone while waiting for him, discussing ordinary matters as the evening progressed. For several minutes, the call resembled countless others exchanged between young couples. Then Angela began describing something she had noticed nearby. During the conversation, she mentioned something that seemed unusual but not necessarily alarming. According to accounts later provided by Rob, Angela observed a green pickup truck repeatedly circling the area. She described the vehicle while continuing the call. At first, the observation appeared more curious than threatening. Parking lots often contain people coming and going, and neither Angela nor Rob initially treated the truck as evidence of immediate danger. Yet as the conversation continued, the vehicle remained nearby. The detail would later become one of the most important elements of the investigation, because it represented one of the few clues connected directly to Angela's disappearance. Within moments, the ordinary phone call became the beginning of a mystery. During the conversation, Rob suddenly heard Angela react to something occurring near the payphone. Reports indicate that he heard her say words suggesting that someone was approaching. The line then became disrupted. What happened next unfolded rapidly. According to later accounts, Rob believed he heard a scream before the connection ended. The conversation stopped abruptly, leaving him with the realization that something had gone terribly wrong. The final moments of the call transformed an ordinary evening into a missing person case. Fate placed Rob Schaefer astonishingly close to the scene, and yet impossibly far from preventing what happened next. After the call ended, he immediately drove toward the location. While approaching the area, he reportedly encountered a pickup truck matching the description Angela had provided. Believing it might be connected to her disappearance, he attempted to pursue the vehicle. The effort ended when mechanical problems affected his own truck. The pursuit failed, and the vehicle disappeared. The sequence of events remains one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. Rob was not hours away. He was only minutes from the location. Yet those few minutes proved enough for Angela Hammond to vanish. Investigators launched an extensive search and examined numerous leads. Witness accounts, vehicle descriptions, and potential suspects were all considered. The green pickup truck became central to the investigation, but identifying the specific vehicle proved difficult. Over the years, law enforcement officials explored multiple theories while continuing to seek information from the public. Despite significant attention, no definitive explanation emerged. Angela Hammond's disappearance remains unsolved, and the phone call continues to stand as one of the most haunting examples of a conversation interrupted by events nobody could fully reconstruct. More than 2 decades later, another roadside disappearance would leave behind a voice instead of an answer. Brandon Lawson's case has already been explored earlier in this series, but it remains relevant here because of the unusual role communication played in the investigation. Unlike Angela Hammond, Brandon was not speaking with a boyfriend or friend from a public phone. He was communicating directly with emergency services and family members after becoming stranded along a highway in Texas. The circumstances differed, but the result was strangely familiar. Investigators were left with a voice that documented part of the mystery without revealing its conclusion. The recording Brandon Lawson left behind became one of the most scrutinized pieces of audio in a missing person investigation. During his 911 call, Brandon appeared distressed and attempted to describe events unfolding around him. The recording generated years of debate because portions of the audio proved difficult to interpret. Investigators, family members, and members of the public listened repeatedly, hoping to understand what Brandon had been trying to communicate. Every phrase attracted attention. Every unclear section inspired competing interpretations. The recording preserved the urgency of the moment while leaving crucial questions unanswered. It demonstrated how communication can simultaneously provide information and deepen uncertainty. Investigators often return to final calls because they represent the last direct connection to the missing. Phone calls possess an unusual quality compared to other forms of evidence. A vehicle can be examined long after it's discovered. Physical evidence can be reanalyzed. A conversation remains fixed. The words do not change. New technology may improve audio quality or reveal additional details, but the conversation itself remains exactly as it occurred. That permanence creates a powerful investigative draw. Detectives return to the recordings because they know the answer may be hidden somewhere within them, even if it has not yet been recognized. Even the clearest conversation contains gaps that only become visible after the speaker is gone. A person may discuss plans, observations, or concerns without realizing which details will later matter. Important information may never be mentioned because it seemed insignificant at the time. Angela Hammond had no reason to know that her comments about a pickup truck would become central to an investigation. Brandon Lawson could not have known that people would spend years analysing his words. The missing individuals were speaking as participants in ordinary conversations. Investigators listened to those same conversations knowing that they may contain the final clues available. Years can pass, technologies can improve, and theories can multiply, yet the words themselves never change. The recordings and recollections associated with these cases remain frozen in time. Angela Hammond is forever standing beside a payphone in Clinton, Missouri, describing a vehicle she found unusual. Brandon Lawson is forever attempting to explain his situation during a late-night emergency call. The people disappeared, but their voices remained. Investigators continue examining them because they represent something rare in missing person cases, a direct connection to the missing person shortly before they vanished. Every case in this chapter ultimately arrives at the same point. Communication ends, searches begin. Families replay conversations in their minds, listening for details that might have been overlooked. Investigators compare timelines and witness statements. The final call becomes a dividing line between what is known and what is not. Everything before the call can often be reconstructed. Everything after, it becomes the mystery. That transition from connection to silence is what gives these cases their unusual power. The voice remains present, but the person does not. The stories of Angela Hammond and Brandon Lawson differ in location, circumstance, and outcome, yet both demonstrate the same unsettling reality. Communication creates the illusion of proximity. Hearing someone's voice suggests they're close, reachable, and safe. When that voice suddenly disappears, the sense of loss becomes sharper, because investigators know exactly where the connection ended. What they cannot determine is what happened next. The voices remained behind as evidence, but the people speaking them disappeared into the silence that followed.